Caleb Voss is the underworld's most efficient cleaner, a man whose soul has been professionally cauterized by 20 years of work. He has lived in a self-imposed emotional vacuum, believing he was born without the capacity for empathy. During a routine erasure of a tenement building, Caleb discovers a witness he wasn't supposed to find, 6-year-old Rosie. As his team moves in to sanitize the site, Caleb prepares to execute the girl to maintain his professional ghost status. Caleb Voss stood in the center of a penthouse that smelled of expensive cologne and copper. He didn't look at the body on the floor. To him, it was no longer a person, it was just a problem he was paid to solve. He moved with quiet, practiced speed, wiping down surfaces with a bleach-soaked cloth. Every fingerprint, every stray hair, and every drop of evidence disappeared under his hands. This was his life. He was the cleaner, the man who made sure the Syndicate's mistakes never made it into the morning news. His hands did not shake. His heart did not race. In the dark world of the city's underground, Caleb was known as a ghost, but he felt more like a machine. For 20 years, he had followed orders without asking why. He had traded his feelings for a steady paycheck and a reputation for being untouchable. He lived in a small, empty apartment with no photos on the walls and no messages on his phone. Silence was his only friend, and he liked it that way. "The job is done," Caleb said into a burner phone. His voice was as flat and cold as a stone. "Good," a gravely voice replied from the other end. "There is another one. A tenement in the old sector. A high-profile witness saw something they shouldn't have. Don't leave any loose ends, Caleb. You know the rules. No witnesses. No mercy." Caleb closed the phone and snapped it in half. He did not think about the person he was about to hunt. He didn't wonder if they had a family or a story. To Caleb, a target was just a mark on a map. He had a debt to the men who had taken him in when he was young and lost, and he paid that debt in blood. He checked his weapon, the cold metal feeling familiar and right in his grip. He put on his black leather jacket, the heavy material hiding the scars on his arms and the hollowness in his heart. He stepped out into the rain, the neon lights of the city blurring into streaks of red and blue. He was a professional. He was efficient. Most importantly, he was alone. He truly believed that he was a man who could never be hurt because he had nothing left to love. He didn't know that tonight, in a dark, muddy alleyway, the machine was finally going to break. He had no idea that the silence he lived in was about to be shattered by a single, tiny voice. The air inside the crumbling apartment was heavy and still. Caleb had finished his work with the same cold precision he had used for 20 years, but as he turned to leave, a soft sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a tiny, hiccuping waist coming from behind a heavy wooden wardrobe. Caleb's hand tightened on his weapon. He knew the rules of the Syndicate: never leave a witness. He kicked the wardrobe aside, expecting a hidden enemy, but instead found Rosie. She was tiny, huddled on the floor in a pink dress that was now covered in gray dust. Her hazel eyes were wide with a terror that reached deep into Caleb's chest. For 2 decades, Caleb had been a man made of iron and ice, but looking at this child, he felt a strange, painful warmth. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his handlers. "Cleaners arriving in 2 minutes. Sanitize the site. Burn everything." Caleb looked at Rosie. If he walked away, she would be lost in the fire. If he stayed and let the team find her, they would finish the job he couldn't. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots in the hallway. The Syndicate's cleanup crew was early. They didn't just want the target, they wanted to erase every trace of life in the building. The machine that Caleb had called his soul finally broke. He didn't think about his debt or his paycheck. He reached down and scooped the trembling girl into his arms. "Close your eyes," he whispered. It was the first kind word he had spoken in years. He kicked through a window, glass shattering like diamonds in the dim light, and scrambled down the rusted fire escape. The cold rain hit them instantly, soaking through his leather jacket and her thin dress. As they reached the bottom and stumbled into the dark, muddy alley, the red laser dots of snipers began to dance across the wet brick walls. Caleb pulled Rosie tight against his chest, shielding her from the wind and the incoming bullets. He was no longer just a hitman, he was a man standing in the crossfire, and for the first time, he had something more precious than his own life to protect. He was her savior, and she was his only hope for a soul. The cold, electronic hum of Caleb's burner phone was the first sign that the world was closing in. He sat in the shadows of the safe house, watching Rosie sleep on a pile of old blankets. The screen glowed with a single message from an unknown number: "The asset is still alive. You are not. Returning her is your only chance." Caleb grabbed the phone in half and threw it into the trash. He knew how the Syndicate worked. To them, he was no longer their best cleaner, he was a broken tool that needed to be thrown away. He walked to the window and pushed aside the heavy curtain just an inch. Below, the city streets looked different than they had yesterday. The neon signs for diners and repair shops didn't look like places to rest anymore. They looked like hiding spots for shooters. Every black car that cruised slowly down the block felt like a threat. Every person standing under a street lamp checking their watch was a potential scout. The Syndicate didn't just have soldiers, they had eyes everywhere. They owned the cameras on the street corners and the radios in the police cars. The city he had protected for 20 years had turned into a giant, steel trap. "We have to move," Caleb whispered, gently shaking Rosie's shoulder. She rubbed her eyes, looking confused and tired. "Is it morning, Daddy?" "Not yet," Caleb said, his voice low and urgent. He handed her a small backpack he had filled with water and crackers. "We're playing a game. We have to be as quiet as mice. If you see anyone looking at us, you squeeze my hand, okay?" Rosie nodded bravely, clutching her tattered doll to her chest. Caleb checked his remaining pistol. He only had 2 magazines left. He wasn't just worried about the men with guns, he was worried about the shadows, the elite trackers who never missed a trail. He knew they were already sniffing the air near the tenement building, looking for a drop of blood or a muddy footprint to lead them here. He led Rosie out the back door and into the maze of the city's service tunnels. The air was damp and smelled of rust. Above them, he could hear the faint sirens of emergency vehicles. He knew those sirens were for him. The Syndicate was telling the world he was a dangerous criminal, making it impossible for him to ask for help. As they stepped into the dark, wet tunnels, Caleb realized he was truly alone. He was a man with no friends, no backup, and a 6-year-old girl who believed he could do the impossible. He had to be a ghost one last time, but this time, he had to leave a trail of safety behind him. The morning sun felt like a spotlight Caleb didn't want. For years, he had moved through the city like a shadow, unnoticed and unbothered. Now, standing outside a small, dusty pharmacy on a quiet corner, he felt as exposed as a nerve. He wore a baseball cap pulled low and kept his chin tucked into his collar, his eyes constantly scanning the street for the telltale signs of a Syndicate scout, a car idling too long, a person lingering by a newsstand. Inside, the world was strangely bright and loud. Caleb walked down the aisles, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. He wasn't looking for ammunition or tactical gear today. He was looking for children's vitamins and a tube of cream for the scrape on Rosie's knee. He picked up a bottle, his large, scarred fingers trembling slightly. The labels were a foreign language to him. He had spent his life knowing exactly which caliber of bullet would do the most damage, but he had no idea which medicine would make a little girl feel better. Rosie tugged on his sleeve, pulling him toward a different aisle. "Look, Daddy. The cereal with the blue whale," she whispered, her eyes dancing with a sudden, simple joy. Caleb looked at the colorful boxes. To him, they were just bright targets, but to Rosie, they were a treasure. He realized then that he had been blind to the normal world for a very long time. He saw the city as a map of escape routes and sniper nests, but she saw it as a place of wonder and small treats. Watching her, Caleb felt a strange ache in his chest. This was what he had been missing, the ability to see a world that wasn't broken. He grabbed the box with the whale and a carton of milk, feeling the weight of the items in his hands. It felt heavier than his pistol. At the checkout counter, elderly the clerk smiled at Rosie and then looked up at Caleb. For a second, Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He waited for the woman to scream, to recognize his face from the Syndicate's lies on the news. Instead, she just pushed his change across the counter. "You have a beautiful daughter, sir," she said kindly. "Take care of her." Caleb nodded, unable to find his voice. He hurried Rosie back out into the cool air, tucking the grocery bag under his arm like it was a precious secret. He was a man who had hunted kings and vanished into thin air, but as he walked down the sidewalk with Rosie skipping beside him, he realized his newest mission was his hardest one yet. He didn't just have to keep her breathing, he had to keep his world bright, even while the shadows were trying to turn it black. Caleb and Rosie spent the afternoon in a small, dusty room above an old garage. The air smelled of motor oil and rain, but inside, the mood was different. For the first time, Caleb wasn't looking at his watch or checking his perimeter. He sat on a plastic crate, watching Rosie as she worked on a small task with serious focus. She had found her old, black leather jacket draped over a chair. It was a heavy, intimidating garment, scarred by scuffs and stained by years of hard use. To the rest of the world, that jacket was a symbol of a man you should never cross. But Rosie didn't see a hitman's uniform. She saw her daddy's coat, and it looked broken to her. From her tiny backpack, she pulled out a sheet of bright, glittering star stickers she had saved from the pharmacy. With careful fingers, she began to press them onto the sleeves and over the rough patches of the leather. One by one, the golden stars began to cover the dark history of the jacket. "There," she whispered, patting a sticker over a small tear in the shoulder. "Now the boo-boos are better." Caleb looked down at the jacket. The sight of the sparkling stars against the grim, black leather was ridiculous, but it made his throat feel tight. He reached out and touched one of the stickers. It was a small, cheap piece of plastic, but it felt heavier than any gold he had ever earned. He realized that she was trying to fix him the only way she knew how. "Thank you, Rosie," he said, his voice unusually thick. He picked up the jacket and put it on. He didn't care that he looked absurd. He didn't care that a Syndicate scout might see the glitter from a block away. For the first time in his life, he wasn't wearing armor to hide from bullets, he was wearing it to honor the girl who believed he was a hero. As he zipped it up, Rosie reached into her pocket and pulled out something else, a small, pink ribbon she had untied from her hair. She stood on her tiptoes and tucked it into her front pocket so it peeked out like a handkerchief. "Now everyone will know you belong to me," she said with a proud smile. Caleb looked at his reflection in a cracked mirror. He saw the scars, the tired eyes, and the blood-stained history. But he also saw the stars and the pink ribbon. He realized that the Heartless Hitman was truly dead, buried under the weight of a child's love. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was a father, and he would burn the whole city down before he let anyone take this jacket, or this girl, away from him. The neon-soaked streets grew darker as Caleb led Rosie toward a deserted subway station. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, and the silence of the city felt like a held breath. Just as they reached the entrance, a tall, thin man stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He was dressed in a gray overcoat that looked too light for the rain, and his hair was as silver as the blade he held casually in his hand. Caleb froze. It was Silas, the man who had taught him everything. Silas was the one who had given Caleb his first gun and showed him how to turn his heart into a stone. He was the only father Caleb had ever known, and now, he was the Syndicate's most lethal shadow. "You look ridiculous, Caleb," Silas said, his voice smooth and cold. He glanced at the star stickers on Caleb's jacket and the pink ribbon peeking out of the pocket. "The Syndicate wants the girl. They say you've caught a sickness, empathy. I told them I'd be the one to cure you." Caleb stepped in front of Rosie, his hand hovering near his pistol. "She's not a target, Silas. She's just a kid. In our world, there are no kids. There are only assets and liabilities," Silas replied, stepping closer. The silver blade caught the flickering light of a nearby street lamp. "Move aside. Let me finish this, and maybe I can tell them you were forced to protect her. You can have your old life back. No more hiding. No more stickers." Rosie gripped Caleb's hand, her small fingers trembling. "Daddy, is that your friend?" The word daddy made Silas flinch, a small crack appearing in his calm mask. For a second, the two men stared at each other, one holding onto a dark past, the other onto a bright future. "He's not a friend, Rosie," Caleb said firmly. He looked Silas in the eye, his gaze steady and filled with a new kind of strength. "I'm not going back. I finally found something better than being a ghost. I found out I'm a man." Silas sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "Then you've signed your own death warrant. And hers." He moved with the speed of a striking snake, the blade whistling through the air. Caleb didn't retreat. He pushed Rosie behind a heavy steel pillar and put Silas's attack head-on. The Judas contract had begun. It wasn't just a fight between two killers, it was a battle for Caleb's soul. As the sounds of steel clashing against steel echoed through the tunnel, Caleb knew he had to win. He wasn't just fighting to stay alive, he was fighting to prove that a monster could truly change. The fog at the shipyard was so thick it swallowed the light from the overhead cranes, turning the docks into a ghostly maze of rusted shipping containers. Caleb gripped Rosie's hand, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was it. The Syndicate had sensed everything they had: armored SUVs, tactical teams, and the cold, unyielding silence of professional killers. "Stay in the crate, Rosie," Caleb whispered, lifting her into a hollowed-out shipping container. He handed her his spare jacket, the one covered in her star stickers. "Don't come out until you hear my voice. No matter what." Rosie's hazel eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering blue light of the sirens in the distance. "I'm scared, Daddy." Caleb kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt more natural than any trigger pull. "I know. But I'm the scariest thing in this yard tonight. I promise." As he stepped back into the fog, the first flash of gunfire lit up the dark. Caleb moved like a shadow, but he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a shield. He didn't hide, he hunted. He moved through the maze of steel, his suppressed pistol coughing as he took down the Syndicate scouts one by one. Every time a bullet whizzed past his ear, he didn't think of his own safety. He thought of the little girl hiding in the dark. Suddenly, a heavy engine roared. A massive truck smashed through a wall of crates, its headlights blinding Caleb. Men in black tactical gear poured out, pinning him down behind a rusted anchor. He was outnumbered and low on ammo. A bullet grazed his shoulder, and another tore us through his thigh. He fell to one knee, the cold mud soaking into his jeans. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard a small, high-pitched scream. "Daddy!" Rosie had seen him fall. She had crawled out of the container, her pink dress a bright target in the gray fog. One of the Syndicate soldiers turned his rifle toward her. Time seemed to slow down. Caleb felt a heat in his chest that had nothing to do with his wounds. He didn't care about the pain. He roared, a sound of pure, fatherly rage, and lunged forward. He didn't like precision, he aimed for protection. He tackled the soldier just as the shot went off, the bullet flying harmlessly into the sky. Caleb fought with a fury the Syndicate had never seen. He used his empty gun as a club, his fists as hammers, and his body as a wall. By the time the fog began to clear, the soldiers lay defeated, and the shipyard was silent. Caleb slumped against the side of the container, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Rosie ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "You did it. You won." Caleb looked at his blood-stained hands, then at the pink ribbon still tucked in his pocket. He was broken, bleeding, and tired, but as he pulled Rosie close, he knew the war was over. He had stood his ground, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't the monster in the story. He was the hero. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city air smelling of ozone and wet pavement. The shipyard was quiet, the heavy silence broken only by the gentle lap of the harbor water against the metal hulls. Caleb sat on the edge of the dock, his legs dangling over the water. His black leather jacket was shredded, and several of the star stickers had peeled away, but the pink ribbon remained tucked securely in his pocket. Rosie sat beside him, swinging her feet. She looked small against the backdrop of the massive cranes, but she no longer looked terrified. She looked like a child who knew she was home. Caleb looked at his hands. They were scarred and calloused, but for the first time in 20 years, they didn't feel heavy with the weight of his past. He had spent his life believing that blood is thicker than water meant you owed everything to the people who made you a monster. Now, he understood the phrase differently. It meant the bonds we choose, the people we would bleed for, are the ones that truly define us. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Inside were the forged identities and bus tickets he had spent the last of his hidden cash to obtain. They weren't going back to his empty apartment. They weren't going back to the Syndicate. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Rosie asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Somewhere with a porch light," Caleb said, his voice soft and steady. "Somewhere where the only thing you have to worry about is being a kid." He stood up, wincing slightly as his wounds protested, and reached down to take her hand. As they walked away from the shipyard and toward the rising sun, the neon lights of the city began to fade behind them. Caleb Voss, the man who was once a ghost, finally had a shadow that wasn't filled with darkness. The Heartless Hitman was gone. In his place was a father, walking toward a new life with the girl who had given him a heart worth keeping. He had spent 20 years erasing lives, but from now on, he was going to spend every day building one.